Have you ever heard of a sultan who ruled for just a little over a year, but whose reign was packed with more drama, betrayal, and bloodshed than a blockbuster movie? Today, we're diving into the chaotic, short, and tragic story of Mustafa IV, the 29th Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. His time on the throne was a whirlwind of rebellion, assassinations, and political maneuvering that would change the course of the empire forever. So grab your popcorn because this is one historical saga you won't want to miss. The story of Mustafa IV begins not with his own ambition, but with the ambitions of those around him. Our tale starts in 1807. The reigning sultan was Selim III, a man with a vision. He was a reformer, determined to modernize the Ottoman Empire and its military. He created a new European-style army called the Nizam-i-Sedid, or New Order. This was a bold move, designed to bring the Empire's fighting force into the 19th century and help it compete with the rising powers of Europe. But as with any major change, it was met with fierce resistance. The Janissaries, the elite but deeply traditional infantry corps of the Ottoman army, saw Selim's reforms as a direct threat. For centuries, they had been the backbone of the military and a powerful political force. They weren't just soldiers. They were kingmakers and power brokers. The idea of a new, modern army that could replace them was not just an insult, it was an existential crisis. They saw their privileges, their power, and their very way of life slipping away, and they were not going to let that happen without a fight. So, in May of 1807, the Janissaries rose up in a massive rebellion. Led by a firebrand named Kabak Mustafa, they marched on the capital, Constantinople, demanding an end to the reforms and the head of the reformist government officials. Sultan Selim III, a cultured and perhaps overly gentle ruler, found himself cornered. He tried to compromise, dismissing his reformist ministers, but it was too little. Too late, the rebels' demands grew louder. They wanted Selim himself off the throne. Faced with an overwhelming mutiny and with his palace surrounded, Selim had few options. His own cousin, Mustafa, was the heir apparent. Pressured by the rebels and his own court, Selim III abdicated. He stepped down from the throne he had occupied for nearly 2 decades, and his 27-year-old cousin was proclaimed Sultan Mustafa IV. For the Janissaries, it was a total victory. They had toppled a reformist sultan and installed one they believed would be their puppet. Mustafa IV's first acts as sultan were to dismantle everything his predecessor had built. He immediately disbanded the Nizam-i-Sedid, the New Order army. The reformist officials who hadn't already fled were hunted down and executed. The Janissaries celebrated in the streets, believing they had restored the old ways and secured their power. Mustafa IV, in essence, handed the keys to the kingdom over to the rebels who had put him on the throne. He was a sultan in name, but Kabak Mustafa, and the Janissary leaders were the real power behind it. Meanwhile, the deposed Selim III was placed under guard within the Topkapi Palace. His life was spared, for now he was a prisoner in the very halls where he once ruled, but Selim still had powerful friends. One of his most loyal supporters was a man named Alemdar Mustafa Pasha, often known as Bayraktar. He was the powerful governor of Rus, a city in modern-day Bulgaria, and a staunch supporter of Selim's reforms. When he heard about the coup in Constantinople, he was furious. He saw the Janissary rebellion for what it was, a step backward. For the empire, a move that would leave it vulnerable and weak. He began to gather his forces, an army of around 40,000 men, with a single goal in mind: to march on the capital, crush the Janissary rebellion, and restore Selim III to his rightful place on the throne. Throughout late 1807 and into 1808, Alemdar Mustafa Pasha consolidated his power and planned his move. The situation in Constantinople under Mustafa IV was deteriorating. The capital was in a state of anarchy. The Janissaries, feeling untouchable, ran wild, creating chaos and instability. The government was paralyzed and the empire was adrift. Mustafa IV, who owed his throne to the rebels, was either unwilling or unable to control them. In the summer of 1808, Alemdar Mustafa Pasha and his army arrived at the gates of Constantinople. He swiftly dealt with the rebel leader, Kabak Mustafa, and secured control of the city. His intention was clear: depose the puppet Sultan Mustafa IV and bring back Selim III. He marched his troops to the Topkapi Palace, ready to liberate the former sultan. This is where our story takes its darkest turn. Sultan Mustafa IV, seeing his reign about to end after just 14 months, made a desperate and brutal decision. He knew that as long as Selim was alive, he would always be a threat, a rallying point for reformers like Alemdar. If he couldn't hold on to the throne, he would make sure no one else could have it either. He gave a horrifying order: execute the deposed Sultan Selim and his own younger brother, Prince Mahmud. According to Ottoman succession law, the throne passed to the eldest living male of the dynasty. By killing both Selim and Mahmud, Mustafa IV would be the last surviving male of the royal line, making it impossible to replace him. It was a gamble born of pure desperation. Palace executioners rushed to carry out the order. They found Selim in his chambers. Despite his tragic situation, Selim fought back bravely, but he was ultimately overwhelmed and strangled. The assassins then moved on to the chambers of the younger prince, Mahmud, but Mahmud's mother and his loyal attendants had been tipped off. They hid the young prince, stalling for time. Legend says they hid him in a furnace or on top of a roof, buying precious minutes. Just as the assassins were closing in on Mahmud, Alemdar Mustafa Pasha's forces broke down the palace gates. They stormed into the courtyard, demanding to see Sultan Selim in a moment of chilling defiance. Mustafa IV's supporters threw Selim's lifeless body out into the courtyard, reportedly shouting, "Here is the Sultan you wanted." Alemdar and his men were devastated by the sight of the murdered reformist Sultan. But their grief quickly turned to fury and determination. They knew Prince Mahmud was still alive and in mortal danger. They fought their way through the palace, found the prince, and secured his safety. With the rightful heir, Mahmud, now under his protection, Alemdar Mustafa Pasha had no more use for the treacherous Mustafa IV. The tables had turned completely. Mustafa IV, the sultan who thought he had secured his rule through murder, was immediately deposed. His reign of chaos had lasted just over a year. And in his place, his younger brother, Prince Mahmud, the one who had narrowly escaped assassination, was proclaimed Sultan Mahmud II. But what of Mustafa IV? His fate was as grim as the one he had planned for his relatives. Mahmud II, now the Sultan, and his powerful Grand Vizier, Alemdar Mustafa Pasha, could not risk leaving him alive. They knew that as long as Mustafa IV lived, he could become a figurehead for another Janissary rebellion. The cycle of coups and counter-coups had to end. So, in November 1808, just a few months after being deposed, Mustafa IV was executed on the orders of his own brother, the new Sultan. He was 29 years old. His death was a brutal necessity in a brutal time, a final, violent act in a year defined by violence. The reign of Mustafa IV is a tragic footnote in Ottoman history, a cautionary tale of what happens when progress is met with violent reaction. He was a pawn in a larger game, a man placed on the throne not for his ability but for his weakness. His rule saw the temporary triumph of reactionary forces, the murder of a visionary sultan, and the near extinction of the royal line. However, from this chaos, a new era was born. The sultan who survived, Mahmud II, would go on to be one of the most transformative rulers in Ottoman history. Having witnessed firsthand the destructive power of the Janissaries and the murder of his brother and cousin, he would dedicate his reign to finishing what Selim III had started. He would eventually and ruthlessly destroy the Janissary cores once and for all, paving the way for profound military, administrative, and social reforms that would reshape the Ottoman Empire for its final century. So, while Mustafa IV's time in power was short and disastrous, its consequences were immense. It was the bloody catalyst that ultimately led to the very modernization it tried to prevent. It's a stark reminder that sometimes history's greatest changes are born from its darkest and most chaotic moments. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into one of the most turbulent years in Ottoman history. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from the annals of history. Let us know in the comments what you think about Mustafa's tragic reign. See you next time.